14 months. That was the number I saw first, before I even read a word of the email. Top left corner of the screen, small and gray. Sent 11:47 p.m., Tuesday, the 12th of September, last year. 14 months before the night my mother-in-law called me into the kitchen and told me to stay in the back, out of sight, when the investors arrived. I was sitting alone at my own kitchen table, the only light in the house coming from the little lamp clipped above the stand mixer. The laptop was open on wood that had 16 years of knife scars in it. I scrolled down, read the subject line again. Ownership restructuring. Confidential. I hadn't opened it out of curiosity. I opened it because 3 hours earlier, Margaret had handed me a single sheet of paper and told me to sign it. Something about year-end tax cleanup. And my hand had signed it without reading a word, the way my hand had signed everything for 16 years. That signature, it turned out, was not the first one. I read the date again. 14 months. Before Daniel and I had ever once argued about the company. Before the grocery chain had ever called. Before anyone in this house had said the word Times Gala times out loud. Which meant the plan hadn't started with an argument. It had started on an ordinary Tuesday night, while I was standing in this exact kitchen teaching my niece how to roll dough without tearing it, and my husband 2 rooms away was typing the first sentence to a lawyer about how to remove my name from a company I had spent 16 years building with my hands. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam anything. I closed the laptop slowly, the way you close a recipe book you already know by heart. I stood up and walked past the blue apron hanging on the hook behind the pantry door, my grandmother's apron, flour ground so deep into the fabric it had become part of the weave. I'd worn it every morning for 16 years. It was the only thing in that house that had never needed a signature to belong to me. 3 days from that night was the Harvest Gala. 15th anniversary of the brand. The night Margaret had said to me, in the same voice she used to discuss the dessert menu, "The investors want a clean story, sweetheart. Let someone else stand on the stage." I had planned to let that comment pass, the way I'd let so many others pass. But 14 months is too specific a number to be an accident. And I am. Everyone who has ever worked a kitchen with me will tell you. A woman who does not forget a number, a date, or a measurement. This is what I did after I finished reading that email. I want to go back further first, because you need to understand what 16 years actually looks like before you understand what it costs to lose it in 1 week. I was 27 when I married Daniel Whitfield. He was 29, working sales for a regional food distributor, the kind of man who could remember the name of every buyer's assistant and every buyer's assistant's dog. His mother, Margaret, had run a small catering operation out of her own kitchen for a decade by then. Competent, well-liked, entirely unambitious. She made good pie crust and terrible small talk, and everyone in Ashcombe, Vermont, trusted her the way small towns trust anyone who has fed them consistently for 10 years. I brought something Margaret's catering business had never had. I brought recipes that came from nowhere anyone could name, from my own grandmother's handwriting. From 3 years working under a pastry chef in Montreal who fired me twice and rehired me twice because, she said, my palate was better than my patience. I brought a burnt sugar cinnamon loaf that Margaret tasted once, in my kitchen, before we were even engaged, and went silent for 11 full seconds before saying, quietly, "We could build something around this." We did. We built Birch Hollow Baking Co. out of Margaret's old catering kitchen, then a rented storefront, then a real building with our name, well, their name, technically stenciled in gold on the window. I ran the recipes. I trained every baker who ever worked the ovens. I wrote the seasonal menus that got written up, eventually, in 3 regional food magazines and once, memorably, in a national one, in an article that used the word soul to describe my bread, and never once used my name, because by then Daniel had become the face who did the interviews, and Margaret had become the name on the paperwork, and I had become, without ever agreeing to it, the person who stayed in the kitchen. I told myself that was fine. I told myself the kitchen was where I wanted to be anyway. For most of those 16 years that was even true. There's a Thursday afternoon I keep coming back to, from maybe 2 years before any of this started, that has nothing to do with the company at all, and everything to do with who I actually was, before I let a filing cabinet define it for me. My niece, Josie, was 7 that year, and she'd shown up after school the way she did most Thursdays, dropped off by my sister for 2 hours while she worked a late shift. I put a stool up against the counter and gave Josie a ball of dough the size of a fist and showed her, for maybe the 40th time, how to roll it without tearing the gluten heel of the hand first, then the fingers, never rushing the middle. "Why does it matter if it tears?" she asked me, the way 7-year-olds ask questions that are actually about something bigger than the question. "Because if it tears," I told her, "the air can't move through it right when it bakes. It'll still taste fine, but it won't rise the way it's supposed to. It'll always be a little smaller than it could have been. She thought about that for a second, flour up to her elbows, and said, like when I don't stretch before soccer. Exactly like that. I think about that afternoon more than almost any other, not because anything dramatic happened in it, nothing did. It was 2 hours of a 7-year-old ruining dough and eating most of the chocolate chips before they made it into anything. But because it was the last version of myself I fully recognized before I started letting other people decide how much of me got to show up in daylight. I was a woman who knew, precisely, why a thing tears, and precisely how to keep it from tearing, and I was teaching that to someone smaller than me for no reason except that it was true and worth passing on. Nobody needed to sign anything for that afternoon to belong to me. It just did. Somewhere in there, I couldn't tell you the exact year, because it didn't arrive as an event. It arrived as a drift. I stopped being asked to sign things I'd read, and started being asked to sign things I trusted. Margaret handled the business side. Daniel handled the relationships. I handled the ovens, the recipe development, the seasonal menu, the sourdough starter that was, by then, 11 years old and had its own name, which was Gerald, because my niece had named it when she was 6 and it had stuck. I want you to understand that I am not telling you this because I was foolish. I am telling you this because trust, inside a family, doesn't announce itself as a risk. It announces itself as love. Every signature I put on every piece of paper Margaret slid across the table felt, at the time, like an act of love. I trusted my husband's mother with the business, the way I trusted my husband with the mortgage and my sister with my house key. That is what family is supposed to mean. The bell over the front door of the bakery has been out of tune for 11 years. It rings a half-step flat, a small sour note every time someone walks in, and every single person who has ever worked there has said, at some point, we should really fix that. Nobody ever has. I used to think that was laziness. I know now it was something else. That flat little note was the one sound in that building nobody had ever tried to make sound better for a magazine article. It was the one thing that was simply, unglamorously, itself. 3 days before the 14-month email surfaced, on a Thursday afternoon that had started like any other, Margaret asked me to come into the office at the back of the bakery, the one with the filing cabinets and the framed magazine covers on the wall, none of which had my name in the caption. Sit down a second, she said, in the voice she used for scheduling conflicts. I sat. The Fenwick people are coming Saturday night, she said. Fenwick Foods was the regional grocery chain we'd been courting for 8 months, a distribution deal that would put our jams and our seasonal loaves in 240 stores across 3 states. It was the biggest number any of us had ever said out loud in that building. They want a clean presentation. Polished. We've brought in someone to handle the stage part of it, a woman named Denise. She does brand storytelling for food companies. Very good at this kind of thing. Handle the stage part, I repeated. The speech, the toast, the meet and greet with the Fenwick executives. Margaret didn't look up from the folder in front of her. You'll still be there, obviously. Just in the kitchen, keeping things running. Where you're strongest. I want to tell you I said something in that moment. I didn't. I said, sure. Because that is the word I had trained myself to say for 16 years whenever something in me went quiet and cold and I didn't yet have language for why. Margaret closed the folder and moved on to the seating chart, and I sat there for another minute listening to her talk about round tables versus long tables, as if the previous 30 seconds hadn't happened at all, as if she hadn't just told me, in the gentlest possible language, that the 15th anniversary of a company built on my grandmother's handwriting did not require my face to be in the room where it mattered. I noticed, distantly, that my hands were folded very still in my lap, the way I fold them when I'm keeping something from moving. I went home that night and didn't mention it to Daniel. I told myself it was a scheduling decision, not a message. I have found, since then, that this is the most common lie people tell themselves in the 3 days before they find out how wrong they were. The next afternoon I needed a copy of our county business license for a health inspection renewal, and Margaret was at a supplier meeting, so I went into the filing cabinet myself for probably the 4th time in 16 years. That's where I found the new operating agreement. I remember the exact motion of it. 2nd drawer down, blue hanging folder, tab labeled in Margaret's handwriting, corporate current. I pulled it half out, then all the way, set it on top of the cabinet because there wasn't room on the desk, and opened it with one finger walking down the tab index the way I've flipped through recipe cards 10,000 times. My finger stopped on a page dated 5 months earlier. I didn't understand what I was looking at right away. Legal language moves slower than recipe language, and I had to read the first paragraph twice, just to locate the sentence that mattered. Then I found it, in a list 4 lines down. Members of the company. 2 names under it. Daniel Whitfield. Margaret Whitfield. Not Elena Whitfield. I stood there in that little office with the flat bell somewhere out front and read it 3 times. The way you reread a number on a scale that can't possibly be right, each time hoping the page would rearrange itself into something that made sense. It didn't. The page stayed exactly the same each time, which is the particular cruelty of paper. It doesn't care how many times you ask it to be wrong. There was a signature line at the bottom with my name typed beneath it, and a signature that was almost mine, close enough that I might have believed, for one disorienting second, that I simply didn't remember signing it. My E's don't loop like that. They never have. My mother taught me cursive from a workbook in 1989, and I have made my E's the exact same closed, flat way ever since, the way she made hers. I photographed the page with my phone before I put it back exactly where I'd found it, corner aligned the same way, because some instinct in me, the instinct of a woman who has spent 16 years being told her strength was in the kitchen and not in paperwork, already understood that I should act like I hadn't seen it. That was the second thing. I want to be precise about the order, because precision is the only thing I have any interest in from here forward. The first thing was being told to stay off the stage. The second thing was finding out my ownership had already been quietly erased 5 months before anyone told me to stay off any stage. The forgery wasn't a reaction to anything I'd done. It was already sitting in a folder, waiting. 16 years. Over 4,000 recipes tested, by my own count, in the notebook I've kept since the beginning 4011, if you want the precise figure. Because I do keep the precise figure. Company revenue that went from $81,000 in our first full year to $6.2 million last year, almost entirely on the back of the seasonal bread line I developed. The one with my grandmother's cinnamon and a burnt sugar crust, that a national magazine once called soulful, without asking whose soul it was. And across those 16 years, across 4,011 recipes and $6.2 million, my name appeared on exactly 0 ownership documents. 0. I want that number sitting next to the others for a second, because that's the number nobody says out loud in families like mine. Nobody frames the imbalance as a number. They frame it as trust, as modesty, as times you're just better with the ovens, sweetheart. It takes finding a forged signature in a filing cabinet to finally translate the feeling into arithmetic. I went back further in my head that same afternoon, sitting alone in the office after I'd put the folder back, and did the kind of accounting nobody teaches you to do until you badly need it. 16 years of 5 a.m. mornings. I counted roughly 280 workdays a year, which comes to almost 4,500 mornings. I'd started before the sun, alone, before anyone else in that family was awake to see it. 3 separate expansions of the building, each one requiring me to redesign the kitchen workflow from scratch, none of which appeared anywhere in the company's official history, except as a line item labeled, renovation, contractor managed. 2 employees I'd personally trained who'd gone on to open their own successful bakeries in neighboring counties, both of whom, when reporters eventually called them, would describe me, unprompted, as the actual reason the place worked. And 1 national magazine feature, the one that used the word soulful, which I still have taped inside my recipe notebook. The word circled in pencil, my own name conspicuously, deliberately, absent from every sentence of it. I am not telling you all of this to ask for sympathy. I'm telling you because I think it matters. Precisely. Exactly how much accumulates in 16 years before a person finally sits down and adds it up. It is never one bad afternoon. It's 4,000 small mornings that quietly taught me my own contribution was assumed rather than credited, until 1 folder in a filing cabinet made the assumption impossible to keep pretending I hadn't noticed. I didn't confront Margaret. I didn't confront Daniel. I went home and I made dinner, and I asked Daniel about his day, and he told me about a supplier issue with the flour distributor, and I nodded in the right places, and later, lying in the dark next to a man I had shared a bed with for 16 years, I made a decision so quiet I didn't even fully register it as a decision. I decided I would find out everything before I said a single word to either of them. The third thing happened the night before the gala, and it is the thing I still, honestly, have to steady my breathing to describe. I'd gone downstairs around 11 for water and heard Daniel's voice through the half-open door of his study low, the particular register men use on the phone when they think the house is asleep. The hallway light was off. I stood in bare feet on cold hardwood, glass of water sweating in my hand, close enough to see a thin blade of lamplight along the door frame and the edge of his shadow moving when he shifted his weight in the desk chair. The house made its usual small sounds around me, the furnace ticking on, the refrigerator cycling in the kitchen, and underneath all of it, his voice, careful and low, the voice of a man who has rehearsed a conversation before having it. I am not going to apologize for standing there and listening. Not to anyone who has ever loved someone enough to build 16 years with them, and then had a reason to stand very still in a dark hallway. The Fenwick deal closes the acquisition conversation too, he was saying. Once they're in as distributor, they've already indicated interest in buying the brand outright. 8 figures, potentially, within 18 months. A pause. No, she doesn't need to be part of that conversation. We'll structure the severance so it's generous. 40, maybe 45,000, standard NDA, non-compete on the recipes. She keeps the house. It's clean. Clean. That was the word Margaret had used about the stage too. I would come to understand that clean was the family's word for erasing me in a way that would look, from the outside, like generosity. He kept talking. Details about timelines. A number 6.2 million in projected first-year Fenwick revenue, a figure I recognized instantly because it was built entirely from a breadline I had spent 4 years perfecting. And then, near the end, the sentence I have not been able to stop hearing since. She's good with the ovens. She was never going to be good at reading contracts. That's always been the easy part about her. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a long time. Long enough for my feet to actually go numb against the floor. And then I did something I am not proud of, and also would not undo. I went back upstairs, got into bed next to him, and when he came up 20 minutes later and asked if I was awake, I said no. In the particular silent way you answer a question with stillness instead of a lie. I left the next morning. Not dramatically. I packed one bag, the way you pack when you genuinely don't know yet whether you're leaving for a night or for good, and I told Daniel I needed to clear my head before the gala, that I'd meet them there. He looked relieved, actually. Relieved that I'd made this easy for him. I've thought about that look more than almost anything else, the relief on the face of a man who believes he has just gotten away with something. I drove without a destination for almost 2 hours, through towns I knew and then towns I didn't, the flat Vermont light going gray and then dark, and I was thinking about the number 6.2 million, and the phrase times the easy part about her times on a loop, when I saw the smoke. It was coming off a converted barn on the edge of a property about a mile past the county line, a lumber storage building attached to a farmhouse, flames already visible through a side window, and a woman on the front lawn screaming a name that I would later learn belonged to her 8-month-old son, who was still inside. I want to tell you what I did next in the order it happened, because I have relived it enough times to know the order matters more than the feelings. I pulled onto the shoulder. I left the engine running. I ran across frozen grass in shoes that were not made for running, and by the time I reached the porch there was already one other person there, a man in his 60s, a neighbor, trying the front door and finding it locked from a deadbolt that had swollen shut in the cold. Smoke was starting to push out from under the eaves on the near side of the house. The mother kept saying the same 6 words, times he's in the back bedroom, please times the way people say things when panic has taken the rest of their vocabulary. The neighbor found a rock the size of a fist near the flower bed and put it through the front window in 2 swings. Glass came down in a curtain, catching orange light from somewhere inside. I went through first. Because I was smaller and the frame was tight, one leg over the sill, weight on my forearm on broken glass, I didn't feel yet. The fabric of my coat sleeve, dragging and catching and tearing. My knee found the floor on the other side. Smoke was already banked along the ceiling in a flat gray layer, but the air near the floor was still breathable, sharp with the smell of hot insulation, and I stayed down on my hands and knees because that's where the air was. I moved across a hallway carpet that was already warm under my palms. Not hot yet, just warm. The way a stovetop feels a minute after you've turned it off, calling the baby's name because it was the only useful thing I had, and because I needed to hear my own voice do something other than panic. The back bedroom door was shut, which I learned later from the fire captain was the single reason the child was still breathing. I reached up from the floor, turned the knob, pushed it open with my shoulder. The room inside was darker than the hallway, smoke thinner here, and I found the crib rail with my fingertips before I found anything else. Worked my hand along it until I felt the blanket, then the small shape underneath it. I didn't stop to unwrap him. I lifted the whole bundle against my chest, blanket and all, and turned back toward the door. He was crying by then, which the fire captain later told me was the best sound I could possibly have heard in that hallway. A baby with enough air in his lungs to scream is a baby who is going to be fine. I kept one hand flat against the baseboard the whole way back, using it the way you use a handrail on a dark staircase, until I found the broken window frame by touch and pushed him through it into the neighbor's waiting arms before I climbed back out myself. glass tearing a second line across my other sleeve, cold air hitting my face like something physical after the heat inside. The mother took her son and folded around him on the frozen lawn, and I stood there with a cut arm and smoke in my lungs and no idea, none at all, that someone across the road had been filming the whole thing on their phone from the moment they saw flame in the window. By the time the fire department arrived, 4 minutes later, the footage had already been sent to someone's cousin who worked in local news. I didn't go home that night. I checked into a motel 40 minutes outside Ashcombe, cleaned the cut on my arm in a bathroom that smelled like bleach and old carpet, and sat on the edge of a bed I didn't recognize, watching my phone light up with numbers I didn't know. I ignored the first 6 calls. On the 7th, I picked up, mostly out of exhaustion. Elena Whitfield? A woman's voice. Unfamiliar. Careful. My name is Claire Voss. I'm a reporter with the Statewide Herald. I got your name from the fire department report. I wanted to ask, are you the woman from Birch Hollow Bakery? I said I was. I have to be honest with you, she said. I almost didn't call. I do human interest, not business reporting anymore, but I pulled up your company before I called, out of curiosity, and I noticed something strange in the state filing database, and I thought given tonight you'd probably want to know. I noticed it, before anyone else does. I sat very still on that motel bed. Your name isn't on the ownership filing, Claire said. For a company built around a product, every article about it credits to you by description, if not by name. I'm not asking as a reporter right now, I'm asking as a person. Did you know that? I told her the truth, which was that I had known for exactly 2 days. Claire didn't push. She said something I've thought about many times since, in the flat, unhurried voice of someone who has covered enough house fires and enough courtrooms to know the difference between drama and fact. I used to do financial reporting before I did this. I still know how to read a filing when something in it doesn't sit right. If you ever want a second set of eyes on that paperwork, no story, no cameras, just eyes, call me back. I didn't call her back that night. I lay awake instead, running the number 6.2 million through my head again, and underneath it, quieter, another number. 14 months. The gap between when the paperwork started moving and when anyone told me anything at all. I called Claire back 3 days later. We met at a diner outside a town I'd never had a reason to visit, and I brought the photograph I'd taken of the operating agreement and my own recipe notebook, 4,011 entries, dated, in my handwriting, going back to the year before Birch Hollow had a name. Claire read both for a long time without saying anything. This signature, she finally said, pointing at the operating agreement, doesn't match the handwriting in this notebook. Not the letter shapes, not the pressure, not the slant. I'm not a forensic document examiner, but I don't need to be one to see that. I know, I said. It's not mine. She was quiet for a moment. Do you want to know what I think happened, or do you want to figure it out yourself first? Tell me. I think, she said, someone in that family has been planning to sell this company out from under you for a lot longer than a few months. The Fenwick deal isn't the beginning of anything. It's the end of something that's been in motion for over a year. And I think the reason nobody told you is exactly what you're afraid it is. They didn't think you'd notice. Or they didn't think it would matter if you did. Why are you helping me with this? I asked her. Somewhere around our second coffee. You said you don't do financial reporting anymore. She turned her cup a quarter turn on the table before answering. 4 years ago I spent 8 months on a story about a construction company skimming from a pension fund. Got it fully documented, sourced, ready to run. My editor killed it 2 days before publication. Legal exposure, advertiser relationships, the usual reasons that are never actually about whether the story's true. She shrugged. A small, tired motion. I switched to human interest after that because I got tired of doing the work, and watching someone else decide it didn't matter. This isn't that story. But it's close enough that I notice when I'm looking at the same shape again. I asked her what I should do. She said something I still think is the single most useful sentence anyone said to me in that entire year. You don't file a complaint about a feeling. You file a complaint about a fact. So before you do anything else, we get the facts. All of them. Quietly. And we don't move until we have more of them than they think you're capable of finding. And if there aren't enough facts, there are always enough facts, she said. People who forge signatures aren't usually careful about anything else. Carelessness doesn't stay contained to one drawer. She was right, though it would take me another 2 weeks to understand exactly how right. That afternoon, though, all I had was a photograph of a bad signature and a woman across a diner table telling me, calmly, that the version of my life I'd been living for 16 years was about to get a great deal more precise. That became, over the following weeks, the entire shape of what I did. I am telling you plainly, without decoration, because that's the only way I know how to tell it anymore. I stopped being a woman who signed things without reading them, and I became a woman who read everything, twice, and wrote down every date. I met a lawyer named Thomas Reyes, a man Claire trusted from an earlier story, who specialized in something I hadn't known was its own field of law, intellectual property, inside family businesses, the specific mess that happens when a person's creative work is owned, on paper, by everyone except the person who created it. His office was above a hardware store, one room, no assistant, a single window unit air conditioner propped in the wall that he apologized for twice in the first 10 minutes. I liked him immediately for that, a man who apologized for his air conditioner and nothing else. He asked me a question in our first meeting that I've repeated to myself more than any other since. Has anyone in this family ever put your name on anything that can't be taken back with a signature? I thought about it for a long time before I answered. The answer was no. Not one thing. My name wasn't on the deed to the building, wasn't on the operating agreement, wasn't on the trademark filing for Birch Hollow, wasn't even, I realized with a strange cold clarity, on most of the recipe cards in the bakery's official files, because those had all been transcribed years ago by an assistant into a shared recipe database that Margaret controlled. The one thing with my name on it, the only thing, was the notebook in my own kitchen drawer. 4,011 entries in my own hand. That's actually not nothing, Thomas said, when I told him this. In most states, the person who can prove original authorship of a recipe, with dated, contemporaneous documentation, has a real claim to trademark that specific formulation and its associated branding elements separate from who owns the company selling it. If your notebook predates their filings, and if it can be authenticated, you may have more leverage than either of them thinks you have. I spent the next 6 weeks doing something I had never once, in 16 years, thought to do. I filed for trademark protection on 4 specific recipes under my own name, individually, with my notebook as supporting documentation for dates of creation, the burnt sugar cinnamon loaf first, because it was the one that had made Margaret go quiet for 11 seconds in my kitchen before we were even married, and because it was, not coincidentally, the exact recipe anchoring the entire Fenwick distribution proposal. The paperwork itself was almost absurdly unglamorous. I sat at Thomas's small conference table 3 separate evenings, photographing pages of a notebook that had flour ground into its spine, cross-referencing dates against old supplier invoices to independently confirm when each ingredient combination had first been ordered, matching my handwriting samples against decade-old grocery lists. Thomas insisted we pull for authentication purposes. It felt, at moments, less like building a legal case and more like writing a second, more careful version of my own life. One where every claim had a receipt attached to it, because I had finally understood that the version of my life without receipts had been erased in 14 months by 2 people who'd simply decided I didn't need any. I filed the loaf first, then a rye bread with a fig and rosemary compote that had been, for 6 years, the single best-selling item on the fall menu. Then, a shortbread. Then, last, almost as an afterthought that turned out to matter more than any of the others, the seasonal sourdough line, the entire family of breads built on Gerald's culture, the one Fenwick's proposal specifically named, twice, in its marketing language, as the signature product driving this partnership. I told no one. I went to work every day. I wore the blue apron. I trained the new hires. I let the bell over the door ring its flat little note every time someone walked in, and I said nothing about any of it, because Thomas had told me something I now understand was the truest thing anyone said to me that whole year. The worst thing you can do to people who've underestimated you is confirm, out loud, that they were wrong before you're finished proving it. There was a Sunday dinner during those 6 weeks that I still think about, because it was the closest anyone came to saying the truth out loud before I was ready for it. Margaret had made a pot roast, the same recipe she'd made every 3rd Sunday for as long as I'd known her, and over dessert a pie I hadn't made, store-bought, which she never would have served before the sale was close enough that appearances had started to matter less. She brought up the Fenwick timeline. Once the papers are signed, she said. Cutting a bite of pie she wasn't going to finish. Things will be so much simpler. You won't have to be here every single morning at 5. You could finally slow down a little. Slow down, I repeated. You've given this place everything for 16 years, she said, and I want to be fair to her, I believe, even now, that she meant this kindly, in whatever version of kindness she had access to. You deserve to just enjoy your life a little. Let the business be the business. Daniel didn't look up from his plate. I watched him not look up from his plate for a long moment, and understood, with total clarity, that letting the business be the business was simply the family's gentlest possible phrase for the sentence I'd overheard in his study times, "She's good with the ovens." That's always been the easy part about her times, softened into something that could be said at a dinner table, without anyone flinching. I said, "I don't think I know how to slow down. I've never tried." "You will," Margaret said, patting my hand once, "the way you'd reassure someone about a minor surgery. Everyone finds their way to it eventually." I drove home that night thinking about how efficient cruelty can be when it's delivered. Nobody had said a single sentence I could have repeated back to a stranger and made them understand, right away, what had actually happened. That's the part people rarely tell you about being erased by people who love you. It almost never sounds like an attack. While it's happening, it sounds like someone offering you rest you never asked for. Daniel called me twice a day during those weeks, always about small things, whether I'd be at Sunday dinner, whether I'd seen the new Fenwick contract draft, whether I was still upset about the stage thing, which was the phrase he used, as if it had been a scheduling inconvenience rather than the first visible edge of something that had been buried for 14 months. I answered him the way I'd learned to answer everyone by then, pleasant, brief, nothing he could later point to and say I'd known. There's a detail I want to include here that has nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with it. During those 6 weeks, I kept Gerald the sourdough starter, 11 years old, named by a 6-year-old alive and fed every single morning at the same time, the way I had for over a decade, even on the mornings I could barely make myself get out of bed. I have thought about why that mattered to me so much, and I've decided it's because Gerald was the one thing in that entire building that had never once needed anyone's signature. He just needed to be fed, consistently, by someone who showed up. That's it. That's the whole relationship. I think some part of me was practicing, every morning, being the kind of person things could actually depend on, in contrast to everyone in that family who had only ever depended on me. The Harvest Gala had been postponed once already, quietly, after the fire. Margaret's idea, framed as respect for everything Elena's been through, which I understood, by then, to actually mean respect for the news cycle that had briefly put my name in 3 local outlets after the rescue, and made it, temporarily, inconvenient timing for a stage moment that was supposed to belong to someone else. It was rescheduled for late November, timed to a harvest theme that had nothing to do with harvest, and everything to do with getting the deal signed before the fiscal year closed. 2 days before the rescheduled gala, Thomas called to tell me the trademark filings had cleared initial review. All 4 recipes were registered under my name, with documentation predating every ownership filing the company had ever made. He also told me something else, something Claire had dug up independently while cross-referencing old county records for an unrelated story years earlier, and had simply been sitting on until it became relevant. Margaret had done a version of this once before, 12 years earlier, with her original catering business partner, a woman named Bev Sutter, who had developed most of Margaret's early recipe line, and then disappeared from every piece of company literature sometime around 2011, replaced quietly on paper by a buyout so small it barely qualified as one. I called Bev Sutter myself. She answered on the 3rd ring, and when I told her who I was and why I was calling, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "I wondered when this would happen to someone else." She told me the rest of it plainly, without much emotion left in her voice, the way people talk about something they finished grieving a long time ago. 12 years earlier, she'd developed most of Margaret's early catering recipes, a lemon curd tart, a braided sweet bread, half the wedding cake line that had built Margaret's original reputation in Ashcombe. She'd been offered, and accepted, a buyout of $6,000 and a handshake, told the business wasn't really built for 2 names on the door. She hadn't thought to ask a lawyer to look at anything. Nobody had told her she should. "I still make that lemon tart at home," she said. "Just for myself now. I never told anyone the recipe's mine. Didn't seem worth the argument." Then, after a pause, "Get a lawyer before you talk to either of them again. That's the only thing I'd do differently." That sentence did something to me that the forged signature hadn't. The forged signature made me angry at what had been done to me specifically. Bev's sentence made me understand it had never been about me specifically at all. It was a method. A pattern with a track record, 12 years old, that had simply been waiting for its next application. I was not an exception Margaret had made. I was the second iteration of something she already knew how to do cleanly. The gala was held in the newly renovated event barn on the property adjoining the bakery. The same barn, in fact, where the company had shot its very first promotional photos 15 years earlier, back when it was still just Margaret's catering op a first purse of la Bine Fay. Back when it was still, there were 60-some guests, Fenwick's regional vice president, and 2 of his directors, 3 local business owners, a state senator's aide, and Claire Voss, seated near the back with a laptop bag she hadn't opened yet, exactly where I'd asked her to sit. The barn had been strung with warm white lights along every beam, and someone had set up small heaters near the doors to cut the November chill, and the whole room smelled like wood smoke and browned butter from the trays coming out of the kitchen behind me every few minutes. I stood in the doorway in the same blue apron, technically off the guest list, technically there to keep things running, the role I'd been assigned 3 months earlier as though it were a compliment. Through the doorway I could see the burnt sugar loaf lit on its pedestal like something in a museum case, the recipe card for it sitting folded in my own coat pocket in the kitchen behind me, 4,011 entries deep in a notebook. Nobody in that room but me had ever bothered to read. I watched Denise, the brand consultant, take the small stage near the dessert table and begin a speech about legacy and craftsmanship that used the phrase family tradition 4 times and my name 0 times. I watched Daniel stand beside her, in the charcoal suit I'd bought him for our 10th anniversary, smiling the specific smile he used for people whose money he wanted, a smile I had once, a long time ago, found charming. There is a moment I want to describe slowly, because it is the only part of that night I asked anyone to slow down for me later, frame by frame, so I could be sure I remembered it correctly. The Fenwick vice president, a man named Gordon Ashby, stood up near the end of Denise's presentation and raised his glass toward the burnt sugar loaf displayed on a pedestal at the center of the dessert table, lit from below like a museum piece, and said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, to 15 years of the Whitfield family's incredible vision. He didn't know he was standing exactly 10 feet from the woman whose grandmother's handwriting was the origin of every ingredient in that loaf. Daniel didn't know that in his coat pocket, folded, was a toast he'd written that afternoon that never once mentioned my name, and that he was 90 seconds away from delivering it. He raised his own glass. He opened his mouth. Claire Voss stood up first. She didn't shout. That's the part people who weren't there always get wrong when they hear the story secondhand. They assume it was loud, dramatic, a scene. It wasn't. Claire simply stood, in a quiet party, in a barn full of people holding champagne, and said, in the same unhurried voice she'd used with me in that diner, before the toast I have to ask something, on the record, because I think Mr. Ashby deserves to know it before he finalizes anything tonight. The room did the thing rooms do when the temperature changes before anyone understands why. The recipe in front of you, Claire said, nodding toward the pedestal, along with 3 others central to this distribution agreement, is federally trademarked under the name Elena Whitfield, not the company. Elena, individually, with documentation predating every ownership filing Birch Hollow Baking Co. has ever made, including the operating agreement filed 14 months ago that removed her as an owner, using a signature she has never seen or authorized. I want to tell you Daniel's face changed in some dramatic, satisfying way. It didn't, not immediately. For about 3 full seconds, he simply looked confused. The specific confusion of a man hearing a sentence structured correctly in words he recognizes individually, but cannot yet assemble into a meaning he's prepared for. Margaret's face changed faster. I watched her hand tighten around her glass, watched something in her jaw go still, in a way I recognized because I'd spent 16 years learning her face, the way you learn a recipe by repetition, until you can predict it before it happens. Gordon Ashby set his own glass down on the nearest table, slowly, and said, to no one in particular, I'm going to need someone to explain that to me before I say another word tonight. Thomas Reyes, who had been standing near the bar the entire evening in an unremarkable gray suit, exactly where I'd asked him to be, walked forward and introduced himself, and I watched him hand Gordon Ashby a folder, the same kind of folder Margaret had once slid across a table to me without a second thought, containing copies of the trademark certificates, the notebook documentation, and a signature analysis from a forensic document examiner Thomas had quietly retained 3 weeks earlier. I did not walk into the center of that room. I want to be honest about that, because I know the version of this story people want is the one where I stride out from the kitchen doorway and deliver some devastating line directly to my husband's face in front of everyone he was trying to impress. That is not what happened, and I have decided I am not interested in making it more cinematic than it was. What actually happened is that I stayed exactly where I was, in the doorway, in my apron, and let the facts do something. Facts are extremely good at doing when you've spent 6 weeks assembling them correctly. They made an argument so complete that no one in the room needed me to say a single word in order to understand it. Gordon Ashby left the gala 11 minutes later. He did not finish his drink. Fenwick's legal team called Thomas Reyes the following Monday to formally withdraw from the distribution agreement, citing, in writing, unresolved intellectual property risk and ownership irregularities incompatible with our compliance standards. I've been asked since whether that felt like a victory in the moment. I've thought about how to answer that honestly. It felt, mostly, like watching a very large, very expensive structure fold in on itself in complete silence, the way a soufflé does not, with an explosion, just a quiet, total collapse that somehow makes more of an impression than a loud one would have. The numbers came in over the following months, and I kept track of them the way I keep track of everything, because by then that had simply become who I was. The Fenwick deal, worth an estimated $6.2 million in projected first-year revenue, collapsed completely within 72 hours, Gordon Ashby's legal team citing, in a 2-paragraph letter Thomas forwarded to me without comment, unresolved intellectual property risk and ownership irregularities incompatible with our compliance standards. Birch Hollow Baking Co.'s 2 remaining regional retail accounts, both smaller chains that had signed on years earlier, expecting the Fenwick partnership to eventually fold them into a larger distribution network, quietly declined to renew their contracts the following spring, citing unrelated reasons that everyone in the industry understood weren't unrelated at all. The company filed for a formal debt restructuring 5 months after the gala, having built its entire growth strategy around a distribution partnership that no longer existed, and a recipe line it could no longer legally sell at scale, without licensing it back from me. A licensing conversation Thomas and I declined to open, on the grounds that I no longer had any interest in doing business with people who had tried to erase me out of one. Margaret resigned from the County Small Business Advisory Board 11 weeks after the gala, quietly, no announcement, her name simply gone from the roster the next time it was published. The seat filled the following month by a woman who ran the hardware store 2 doors down from Thomas's office. Daniel, who had turned down nothing and given up nothing in the 14 months he'd spent planning to give up me, ended up losing the one asset the entire scheme had been built around protecting. Last I heard, through channels I didn't go looking for, he'd taken a sales position with a food distributor 2 states away, a smaller company, a smaller title, the kind of job he used to describe, back when we were first married, as the job you take before you build something of your own. I filed for divorce 2 weeks after the gala. I did not ask for spousal support. I did not need it. I asked for exactly one thing beyond the standard division of property: full, exclusive, permanent ownership of every recipe I had ever created for that company, retroactive to the date of creation. Thomas told me, with something close to amusement, that it was the cleanest filing he'd ever seen. A divorce attorney friend of his described, usually people fight over the house. She fought over the bread. He wasn't wrong. The house was never the thing I couldn't stop thinking about at 3 in the morning. The recipes were. Daniel called me once, about 4 months after everything, on a night I happened to still be at the old bakery late, alone, going through boxes of my own things I still hadn't moved out. He asked if we could talk. I said we were talking. He was quiet for a moment and then said something I think about more than I expected to, because it was the first honest sentence he'd said to me in over a year. I never thought you'd actually read the contracts, he said. I don't mean that the way it sounds. I mean I think some part of me believed, the whole time, that you couldn't, that it wasn't a thing you were capable of. And I built an entire plan around a version of you that never actually existed. I told him that was, without question, the most honest thing he'd ever said about why any of it happened. I also told him it didn't change anything, and he said he understood that. And we didn't speak again after that call, not because either of us was angry by then, but because there simply wasn't anything left that needed saying. I opened my own bakery 7 months later, in a smaller storefront 2 towns over, with a sign out front that says, simply, Marcia's times my grandmother's maiden name, the one I'd been using quietly on my trademark filings the entire time, the one that had never once belonged to anyone but the women in my family who made things with their hands and never asked anyone's permission to put their names on them. I brought Gerald with me, 11 years old now, still fed every morning at the same time, still the one relationship in my life that has never required a signature. I hung a bell over the new front door. I had it custom-tuned, deliberately, to ring a half-step flat the exact same sour little note as the old one, because I realized, somewhere in that last year, that the flat note had never actually been a flaw. It was the one honest sound in an entire building full of things designed to sound better than they were. Last week, the mother from the fire came in with her son, who's over a year old now, and mostly interested in the display case rather than in me, which is exactly how I want it. She didn't know anything about the lawsuit or the trademarks or any of it. She just knew I was the woman who'd carried him out of a burning hallway, and she came in because she'd heard I'd opened a place of my own, and she wanted, she said, to be one of my first customers. I gave her the burnt sugar cinnamon loaf. On the house. Not because I needed to prove anything to her, she'd never doubted me for a second, but because some things are worth giving away for free, precisely because you finally, legally, unquestionably own them. Josie comes by most Thursdays after school now, the same as always, and I put a stool up against the same kind of counter, and hand her a ball of dough, and she still doesn't tear it, because she learned that a long time ago from someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Some Thursdays I tell her a little more of the story than I did the year before. A little more each time she's old enough to hold it. I want her to grow up understanding that the people who teach you the most are not always the people whose names end up on the door, and that the only way to make sure your own name gets there is to write it down yourself, in your own hand, long before anyone asks you to prove it belongs to you. People ask me sometimes if I got the company back. I didn't, and I want to be clear that I never actually wanted it back. What I wanted, and what I got, was smaller and more permanent than a company. I got my own name on the one thing that was always, only, ever actually mine. I didn't take back a business I'd spent 16 years building for someone else. I just finally stopped lending them my name for free.